Well, hello everybody, and thank you all. Look, let me get my video going. I'm sorry. Hello everybody, and thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to participate here today, join this conversation. Today we're going to talk about the inner planets, and I want to preface the talk by saying, we pay so much attention to the heavy outers, the transpersonal planets, Pluto, especially Uranus, Neptune. They seem to occupy a lot of the discussions. And maybe I'm wrong. Somebody please correct me if I am. But the more that I work with do client work, the more that I read, the more that I study, I realize that we have a certain intimacy with Mercury, Venus, and Mars, which really, I believe, and I'm going to use the word eclipses to a great degree the effect of the outer planets on us, because they really describe who we are. And today we're going to talk primarily about Venus and Mars, and they're showing up in Mercury's house. So we're going to have all the inner planets coming to this meeting today as well. The title of this talk is Spiritual Beings, Human Experience. And we're going to look in the time that we have at the current Venus-Mars conjunction of 2017. So we've all have heard this meme, this New Age meme many times, that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. And what this means is that we are here for the human experience. We're here for the direct emotional experience, because that's really how we learn something. When something happens to a neighbor or somebody that we know, some calamity befalls them, some great event happens to them, yes, we can appreciate it, but we don't really learn much from it. It doesn't mean much to us. But when we lose our job, or when we get injured, or when our relationship ends, or something happens to us, it's meaningful because it happens on an emotional level, and that's how we learn. And so we're going to be looking at the events of our lives really through that lens today, through that emotional experience. And we have to remember that the core emotion is love, and that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who's gifted us with that understanding. Relationships are ground zero for personal growth. It's where it all happens. The cycle of Venus and Mars correlate directly to how we are self-actualizing through a relationship. So this conjunction just occurred a couple of days ago on the 5th of October. It occurred at 19 degrees of Virgo, and it initialized a 2-year cycle. Somebody there maybe needs to mute. It initiated a 2-year cycle of relationships with ourselves and others in some way. And this was the second of 3 conjunctions in the sign of Virgo, which are the conjunctions occur approximately 2 years apart. And this long duration, these 3 conjunctions over 6 years, 8 years through these signs, is in Virgo, really amplifies the archetypal importance of Virgo as part of the way that Venus and Mars are working in our charts, because this is kind of like a solar return. This conjunction, this point where is a beginning, and it lays out a blueprint. It shows us a template of what our relationships over the next 2 years are going to be like. We'll see endings, we'll see beginnings, we'll see resets. All of our relationships are going to be reset in some way. And hopefully, they will be reset in a positive way. And we can examine this planetary event from 3 perspectives. We're going to look at the mythology, we're going to look at some of the astronomy, and obviously we're going to look at the astrology in order to understand how this current cycle can potentially unfold. So the archetype of Venus, actually both archetypes are multivalent. There's a wide, varied spectrum of expression from light to shadow. And we know that whether it expresses as light or expresses as shadow really is going to be determined by the consciousness that's brought to the chart. A horoscope, a natal chart, an event chart is simply a two-dimensional representation of the correlation between what's overhead and what's here on Earth, or geocentric view of it. But that chart could be for anything. It could be for our pet. It could be for a business. It could be for a house that we just bought. It could be for a wedding, or it could be for a person. So it really depends on what's brought to it. The chart itself is two-dimensional. It's flat, if you would. That third dimension that's brought into it, which is the consciousness, is the determinant of how that spectrum is, that expression is going to unfold, and where along the spectrum we're going to see either the light or the shadow, or in most cases, some combination thereof. Excuse me. So archetypically, Venus Aphrodite has as many faces as she has lovers. As the goddess of desire and fertility, and sometimes war, she was Inanna to the Sumerians, she was Ishtar to the Babylonians, and I believe that the actual pronunciation of Ishtar is Easter, and she was Hathor to the Egyptians. And I think if we looked through any of the other classical ages, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, we would find a similar correlation, and in some cases it would be the same goddess. Relationships are her playground. That's her world. She's all about relationship. And if you read the mythology, she had many, many different kinds of relationships. And archetypically, she can express through a number of different mythological archetypes. As Circe, as the sorceress, she can be an enchantress. She can be a seductress and lure someone into that relationship. Like Psyche, there can be jealousy. There can be this vanity and jealousy that occurs in terms of the way she expresses through the relationship. And with Eros, sometimes she only needs to be draped in her beauty and her erotic love, like the statue that we see her. There are many, many ways of seeing her, and we can actually explore each of these as an entire understanding of this archetype. And if in the charts and in readings and client sessions, just in our interactions with others, if we can see that any one of these archetypes could be being expressed at any given time. Astronomically, she's our nearest planetary neighbor. There's an intimacy. We have an intimacy with all three of these planets that we're going to talk about today. They're very close to us. They are us. They're within us. We know that. But their proximity to us is not an accident. It's part of the scheme of things, the cosmic scheme of how the energies are coming down to us, and they do filter down to us in their final form. In the really very complex frequencies of Venus, Mars, and Mercury. She lies within the Earth's orbit as our closest planetary neighbor, and there's this sensual intimacy that touches body, mind, and spirit, and it's because of I would say that the astronomy, the closeness, the actual physical closeness to us is part of this context. We know her as the morning star and as the evening star, and at this conjunction, she greets us as the morning star, which was known as the epithet of Aphrodite Pandemos. And Pandemos means for all the people, and she relates in this aspect, in this expression, to her rulership of Taurus, her earthy nature. And her connection to the earth, and to a baser sensuality, which can kind of move into promiscuity as well. It's not necessarily her higher expression, but it's a very earthy, and again, there's no judgment here. But there are. It's important to recognize that there are two ways that Venus can express, and morning star and evening star is the physical manifestation of how they show up. In early February of next year, she's once again going to conjoin with the sun, and soon after become the evening star. There's a period of about 2 to 3 weeks, I believe. I think it's 14 days. That that Mercury or Venus is actually what's known as combust. I know that that's not an EA particular an EA concept, but because of the intensity of the sun's energy, the inner planets really are lost in the sun's brilliance, and they take a couple of weeks to emerge after the conjunction with the sun, whether it's in the retrograde cycle or in their direct cycle. And here she appears as Aphrodite Urania. She's associated with Uranus, with the sky. She's heavenly. She's spiritual. She was the Semitic queen of the heavens. And then again, in early November, she will retreat again behind the sun and then reemerge as the morning star. So over the next 2 years, we're going to see her in both phases, and these dates will correlate to where to look for her and when. In the natural zodiac, she has rulership of 2 signs. We all know that inwardly directed Taurus is our relationship to ourself. This is our self-worth. It's what we place value on. It's what I find to be most significant. It's where we find meaning, because the value, what we value really is determined by what has meaning for us individually. To some people, that's money. For other people, that's love and connection. For it, again, there's a wide range of the spectrum of how this can show up. But I think that meaning is the important word here. That in that second house Taurus, we identify where the real meaning in our life is, and in the meaning in what we have to pursue, what we deem to be our priorities. And there's also a magnetic association with Venus. She literally correlates to magnetism. And again, it correlates to our self-worth and our self-love. This is a 7/24 frequency that we are emanating. It's part of our energetic matrix, and it's constantly on. We are probably unaware of it, but on some level, everybody else who we encounter at any distance from us is aware of it. This is something that transcends time and space. It has no limitation in terms of its broadcast range, if you would. And it really relates mostly to outwardly directed Libra. It originates in that second house Taurus archetype, where we have established that modulation of that frequency according to our self-love or self-worth. But it's what we broadcast out. And it's really the determinant of who and what we attract, the people that we attract, the circumstances that we attract. It's an invisible energetic vibe that we broadcast. And you can think of it as your personal Wi-Fi signal. I mean, it's always out there, and everybody's got a receptor for it. And it has encapsulated message in it, just like your Wi-Fi signal, just like the email and the web pages that you download onto your computer. Well, everybody else is downloading that data that we put out, and that's going to determine what we attract. We're going to get a matching holistic resonance from it. And if we are resonating that we need somebody to complete us, that we don't feel whole within ourselves, that we don't really love who we are, we're going to attract somebody who's not necessarily going to complete us. We're going to attract somebody who is going to be attracted to that vulnerability. And at time and time again, again, in client work, when I tell this story, they look at me and I say, of course, that's what happened. All the relationships that started out well, they were having fun, getting along, the sex was great. And somewhere along the line, they realized that they needed an exit strategy because everything had turned around. And it's because of that frequency that we hold about ourselves. If that data is corrupted, it's going to attract an outer world event that is resonant to that distortion in some way, a person or circumstances, or it will attract someone who will help us resolve it as well. So it has many ways of working. And again, it comes down to the consciousness of the individual, and what their intentions are, and what it is that they're hoping, they're intending to achieve in their own soul growth. Mars is our nearest neighbor outwards towards the heavy transpersonal planets. And we know Mars basically through the Greek and the Roman mythologies. Anybody who has recently seen the Wonder Woman movie is now quite familiar with the god Ares, who's the god of war. He was forceful, he was violent, he was savage. It was bloodlust. There doesn't seem to be any redeeming value in the Greek mythological stories of this archetype. But the Romans held an entirely different perspective on Mars. And actually, the earliest accounts of Mars, he was an agrarian. He tended the fields. He was close to the earth, and he was really about agriculture. And it kind of that archetype kind of faded away as the patriarchy of the Roman pantheon expanded. But the Romans saw him as the guardian and protector, rather than as a bloodlust, forceful, violence, individual. He was full of valor and courage. And in EA, we associate courage. I associate courage primarily with the Mars instinct. He was the keeper of the peace, and he maintained boundaries. He was the protector, and sometimes he was the avenger when that was necessary. And given these archetypes and the intensity and the potential that is there for violence and conflict, is it surprising that Mars is the color of blood? He has rulership of two signs as well. In the outwardly directed fire sign of Aries, he expresses as our core instinct. The first house, the ascendant, and Mars in general, there's not a lot of precognition that happens there. It's total instinct. Traditional astrology likes to frame the ascendant as what we project out in the world. I kind of think of it more in the analogy that it's like the tip of our nose. Everybody in the world can see it, but it's invisible to us to a great degree, unless we have done some work and done some self-examination and reflected on what feedback we get back from others in terms of what they see on the tip of our nose. But it's pure instinct. There's no predetermination really that comes from it. That really relates to the seventh house as the projection, as I described, how we project that frequency of who we are outward into that seventh house, that full moon area where things show up and are illuminated. As the traditional ruler of the sign of Scorpio, he becomes the lower octave of Pluto. Pluto says jump, Mars says how high. Our conscious choices, he's responsible for our conscious choices according to Pluto's deeper subconscious desires. We're not always aware, most people are not always aware of, the deepest motivations that we have, but Mars is acting on them whether we're aware of it or not. If somebody has a deep soul intention to attain greater consciousness, then Mars is going to, the choices that they're going to make and the goals they're going to pursue is they're going to look for a spiritual teacher. Maybe they'll go to India. They will study, metaphysics, cosmology, astrology, different of these different mantic sciences, but it's not always something that there's an awareness about it. Again, it's an instinctive choice. If somebody has the deepest desire for recognition and glamour and abundance, then their choices, they're going to go out and buy a flashy car and a big house and take a big vacation and spend all their time telling all their friends about it. It acts out according to the soul's, Pluto's deepest unconscious needs for security. Whatever makes us feel secure, Mars is going to respond to that. Generative Mars correlates to the self-actualizing life force that initializes at birth and drives us forward. Excuse me. So the cycle of Venus-Mars correlates to how one is self-actualizing through relationships. It's ground zero for relationship, it's ground zero for our own self-growth, our own soul growth. It's no coincidence that the glyph for the planet Venus looks like a hand mirror, because in relationship, in that one-on-one, that seventh house event that occurs, and sometimes it's a circumstance as well as a person, it is reflected back upon us in some way in order for us to understand ourselves. It's really the dynamic that's occurring there. And in that reflection, hopefully that we reflect upon it, but in that information that comes back to us, that return of data feed, if you would, we get information that really facilitates our self-actualizing work. And again, this is going to depend on the consciousness that's brought to the chart. It's going to be different for everybody. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to necessarily, have tremendous soul growth, in the relationship. And as we well know, I think we hear more hardship stories about relationship than about relationships that are really successful and where things really are working out well. But it's about a feeling of heart and soul connection to someone else. We have to really be in touch with our own heart, with our own feelings, with our own emotional nature, our own primal nature as well as we can. I mean, that brings in the moon. But we have to understand ourselves before we can really accept and unconditionally love somebody else. And it really does come down to that. It is about that unconditional love that is so difficult to achieve in a relationship. So this conjunction is occurring in Virgo, and anybody who has a Virgo planet is probably all too familiar with the archetype. I think it's an often misunderstood archetype, perhaps, or an archetype that people think, well, gee, I'd rather be a Sag or a Pisces or a Leo, but Virgo is really where the work gets done. Virgo, its polarity Pisces, the 6th and 12th houses are threshold archetypes. And we know this from several different directions. Mercury, that rules Virgo, has the ability, the guide of souls, is the ability to move between dimensions, to move between worlds. We know mythically that he was the only god who could enter and leave the underworld without harm. And in our own charts, in our own life, Mercury is the facility that we have to go down into our own shadow without harm, to really understand our own subconscious without falling prey to the demons that we're afraid we're going to encounter when we go into that space. But it's also a liminal space in terms of the chart itself, because the 6th and 12th houses represent that liminal space between the waning and waxing cycles of the chart. The lower half of the chart, the 1st through 5th houses, are all personal. It's all about us. It's all about, quote, me. When we get to the 6th house, we're not in a relationship yet, but we really become aware of other people for the first time. To a great degree, they're still mostly background to our universe, if you would. We're not in a relationship with any of them, but we become aware of the what's expected of us. We become aware of the social norms and mores, and there's a contrast that opens up, between us and others. In Leo, we've come to the fullest display of ego, of that egoic expression. That can often manifest as narcissism, could be self-absorption, personal aggrandizement, and not to malign Leo. And I will, tell you up front, I have both, strong Virgo and strong Leo in my chart, so I can say all these things. But it's also, it's also our creativity, and it's also, beautiful generosity of spirit. But Virgo is that transition space from the personal to the social sphere. It's where we have to clean up our act. It's where we have to Because we've become aware of ourselves in relationship to others, we can see ourselves more objectively for the first time. It's a very kind of morning after experience where there is crisis through growth through crisis, because we become aware of who we are, and we begin to see our shadow. We begin to see some of our behavior that really is over the top. And we recognize that if we're going to be in relationship with others and be able to live compatibly with other people, once we cross that seventh house cusp, the descendant, then we really need to refine our nature. And so this is what's happening in Virgo. And this is really what's happening with this conjunction. It's really the base note of what's happening here. We really have to, it's about self-examination and about the work on the self. It's ruled by it's ruled by Mercury, which correlates to our intellect and our cognition. We all pretty much know, I think everybody here knows that, in Gemini, Mercury is the outer expression where that cognitive understanding, that intellect really is extended outward in order to understand our immediate environment. We name things, we organize it intellectually, and again, to find, an intellectual security in our world. But when we get to Virgo in the sixth house, that intellectual gaze is turned inward. And it becomes self-observation, self-examination, and sometimes self-condemnation. Depending on how honest we can be with ourselves, and again, it depends about, just like being able to go into that shadow, and not be afraid of the demons, and recognize that we have to maybe dance with them. We have to recognize who they are, and come to terms with them. We measure and compare ourselves to others, and this triggers our primal lunar nature that only wants to be secure in what's familiar. Our moon, we don't want to change. Our south node, we basically want to keep on doing what we've been doing. It works for us. We know it's not perfect, perhaps, but all of the pitfalls, all the craters in our moon are known spaces. We know how to navigate those craters, and so we're okay with it. Moving forward, moving towards the future, changing is scary, because there's that's going to be a new meteor impact that we don't know about. So we're going to hold on to what we're doing. So when this familiarity is threatened, we have a crisis of self-awareness, and we become aware of any of the distortions in ourselves, so that we can find, as I said, that compatibility, join in the social sphere of Libra and beyond. Not everybody's going to do this. Some people are going to go round and around and, just go through, a total cornucopia of relationships their whole life, or stay in a relationship that doesn't work and basically suffer the consequences. That's a topic, I think, for another talk. I'll leave that one alone. So evolution is not just a theory, it's a fact. I think we all agree upon that. The soul's singular purpose is self-awareness in order to catalyze growth. And as we move through the sign of Virgo and enter the waning cycle of the horoscope, we begin to participate in the collective with its shared resources, shared beliefs and ideas, consensus realities, norms and standards, communal associations, and of course the collective unconscious. We become part of that ocean of humanity. But we cannot successfully navigate this outer world that now includes others without the refinement of our own nature. The need to work on the self applies to the culture and the society at large as well. And I think we can all agree that is what is happening on a global scale right now. And it's how I understand the chaos, if you would, what's happening to us in the world, whether it's the weather or whether it's the politics or the global confrontations or the polarity that's being created within our own country, or again, globally in the world. It's not meant to divide us. It's not meant to really take us down. It's meant to show us where the work needs to get done. as a whole. I have a friend who's very fond of saying that there's really only one of us on the planet. And clearly, that's a real stretch right now. There is one of us, but it's got a bazillion ways in which it's thinking and moving and acting. But what is happening, just as an aside from my perspective, is that everyone to some degree, is finding their own individuality. We may not like what their individuality looks like, but Uranus's transit of Aries, and this is a side issue, though it does relate to Mars. Uranus's transit of Aries is bringing out that, in some cases, that radical selfishness, that radical self-absorption and narcissism. But it needs to come out. It needs to be outed. So we're seeing this crisis, this growth-producing crisis happening on a global collective scale as well. And certainly it's not pleasant. Certainly it's uncomfortable, but it's a necessity. Going back as far as Ptolemy, they believed that basically there were two forces that were active in the world: fate and necessity. And I kind of assign fate to, our soul intention, to Pluto, to our North Node, to what our soul is intended to do going forward. Necessity comes into play when the subjective ego gets in the way and we kind of veer off course, and we need some event, some relationship, some circumstance, some inner experience to get us back on course. And so it's all good. It's not always all not painful, but in the end, it's all good. And again, I think anybody here would agree. I know from my own perspective that all of the worst things that have happened to me have turned out to be the best things that could have happened to me. It's just that it was necessity. They needed to happen because I was unable to make them happen myself. So I will leave that confession, as it is. So culturally, in order for the community to thrive, certain criteria need to be met. We need social equality, we need brotherhood, we need mutual respect, and we need the protection of personal freedoms. And I think that these are all Venus and Mars issues. Certainly the broader as well, the Virgo and Pisces as well. We could probably bring in the whole natural zodiac. Culturally, the collective is also passing through this Virgo-Pisces threshold in order to achieve these communal refinements. So we just need to hang on. It's all good. We're headed towards some place that we have created. We've chosen to be here, and we have intended for what's happening, whether we realize it or not. Just like we chose our parents, we chose the circumstances of this global community as well. So just hang in there. Venus and Virgo will attract the experiences that bring our attention to our relationship with ourselves. The work's going to be about how we feel about ourselves, the values that we hold on to, and where our priorities lie. And again, we've got to remember that Venus is where we find meaning. That meaning becomes our priorities. So it's a whole reworking of to a great degree of where we've been going. It's self-examination. Insecurity and lack of faith in oneself can emerge as part of this Virgo process. We can feel not good enough. We can feel that we're not ready, which is most often what happens with Virgo. So we have to recognize that and realize that it's fake news. It's a false. It's a self-imposed stumbling block. In the natural zodiac, Virgo correlates to the quincunx, in conjunct. It's the 150-degree aspect of growth through crisis. And the reason it's a difficult aspect, if we look at in the natural zodiac from Aries to Virgo, Aries is fire and it's cardinal. Virgo is earth and it's water. The two of them have nothing in common. All of the inconjunct aspects bring together two archetypes that have nothing in common. So it's difficult. Think of, being in a relationship with somebody that you have nothing in common with them. I mean, it's even hard to have a conversation. What do you talk about? So this is the nature of Virgo to some degree, where we need an adjustment. We need to somehow change our course of direction. It's almost as if we're sailing from California to Hawaii, and we recognize that we're off by 2 degrees, and that 2 degrees is going to take us out to Vietnam. We're not going to make it to Hawaii, so we need to change course. We need to realign our direction and our heading, and get back on course. It's what Virgo does for us. Situations will emerge externally and internally that can create emotional crises for us. And again, getting back to what I said at the beginning, this is the key, because unless we experience it emotionally, it hasn't happened. We might as well be watching it on television. It's background to our universe. It has no connection to us until we feel it emotionally. Sometimes something that we have ignored or denied can create guilt and the need to cleanse or purify what has been unearthed. So we have, again, we have that cleansing and purifying archetype here of what has been uncovered as we went down into that underworld, into that subjective unconscious, individual unconscious. And in concert with Mars, this can extend to remorse and regret for the choices and actions that we have made, perhaps instinctively without any consideration, because Mars is our choices. So, if we're making choices unconsciously, we're going to suffer the consequences of it. We're going to end up with relationships failing, with circumstances popping up for us that are going to show us that we need to make different choices. Sometimes we almost have to, again, it's necessity, keep making that same choice until the fear of the new choice is outweighed by the pain of the old choice. Excuse me, I have to keep moving this thing around so I can see this. So Mars in Virgo will generate the circumstances and relationships that facilitate the healing that is found to be needed in the form of practitioners, medicines, and healing modalities. This is an interesting thing, because I believe, that the outer world does respond to our inner world. And when we are in a place within ourselves where we recognize that we need healing and we want to be healed, we open to it, then we open the space for that to happen in the outer world. It brings in, a whole other concept here. And I could, at some point, do a whole talk about it, about our lunar self and our solar self. The lunar self, our moon, again, is that primal nature that wants to hold on to what's familiar and keeps making the same choices and same decisions to really stay within that stay in that same treadmill, if you would. The solar self is the hero's journey. The moon in Cancer, the moon and Cancer, again, in the natural zodiac, correlate to the squares. It's that first square. And squares are hard. And, squares actually represent something that we can't resolve on our own. We need somebody else in the picture to help us resolve it. And it does become, a relationship thing most often. But Leo correlates in the natural zodiac to trines. And if you read any of the stories of the hero's journey, Theseus, when he was, in the Minotaur's cave, Ariadne came along and gave him the crumbs, or the thread, to leave behind him so he could find his way out. A helper showed up, and Jason received the golden fleece as a gift. Hercules received the Nemean lion's coat as protection. The heroes have had helpers and gifts that have shown up for them. So the point I'm making here is that when we have the courage of Mars, when we take that initial cardinal self-actualizing step to actualize what our soul has intended, then the helpers and the gifts will show up. We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be insecure about it. It's when we hold back and we resist and we kind of, refuse to, we get stubborn and fixed in our ways. That's when we really create the crises and the difficulties that show up, because they're a necessity to get us to really to be more of our sun, if you would, than our moon. And I don't want to linger on that, because we can have a whole discussion and there's all kinds of opinions about it. But there is a difference between that primal nature and that solar self. And we will experience a different experience in our lives, depending on the choices that we make. And that choice is Mars, and that choice is also Venus's priorities and our self-worth. It's the belief, even if we don't have to think we're perfect. We just have to have this sense of ourselves that we'll be okay, that we can do it, that it's what we're supposed to do, and because it's what we need to do, that we will be able to get it done. If our work, is about, again, if we're looking at Leo and Virgo here, if our work is, about feeling disconnected, we've just become so separate. We've run that separate principle, separateness principle out to its outer limit. Or if we're needing too much self-recognition, if we're needing to have too much self-absorption, then service to others, either one-on-one in community, moving towards that Aquarius polarity of getting out of ourselves, finding, if you would, the higher octave of our ego in community, of how we can participate in the collective, how we can bring our gifts and our creativity to the community and be able to work in community in some way, is always the pathway to find that fulfillment. So this is the chart for the conjunction. Excuse me one second. Linda, how are we doing on time?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, good. All right, so this is the chart, and basically I just want to talk about the aspects, the major aspects, if you would, to the conjunction itself. There's a lot more going on in the chart, because certainly it reflects all of the current transits that we're experiencing. But we're talking about Venus and Mars here today, so I'm going to just zero in a little bit with the time that we have on these aspects. We've got a square to Saturn and Sag. We have a trine to Pluto and Capricorn, and we have two oppositions to Neptune and to Chiron in Pisces. The conjunction occurred 2 hours before the full moon. So, again, it was embedded with that full moon energy that was about to be fully illuminated, if you would. It's a strong placement. Sun and moon are in opposition, though they're not partile, but there's a very, very strong energy there in the chart. And again, it's that energy of manifestation that, things are going to happen here. Virgo is an earth sign, and there's a practicality and there's a materiality to it. It's not all going to be something that's going to happen internally or emotionally. It is, not emotionally. It's not all intellectually. It is going to generate real events. And what really is interesting is that the full moon, actually this opposition is in, the full moon was not, but this opposition is in the signs ruled by Venus and Mars. So that's really restating this conjunction and adding significant focus to the interplay and synthesis of the relationship issues of Venus and Mars. So we have a disseminating square to Saturn and Sagittarius. And this is a crisis in consciousness, Dane Rudhyar. We're aware of something, but we're ignoring it or denying it. Sagittarius is truth, and Saturn in Sagittarius has clearly been the search for truth. Whether we talk about fake news or whether it was WikiLeaks or Ed Snowden or any of the truth, the issues swirling around what is true and what is false in our world and in our own lives has become very apparent. And this is also about having the courage to self-examine. It's, again, we're looking at Mars and Venus and self-worth. So it's about taking that courage to really look at ourselves and to ask ourselves, is this true? Is this real? Is this really what I want? It's a ninth house, sixth house event, archetypically. And it's about taking responsibility, not just for who we have been, but for who we are becoming. We're looking at Virgo and Pisces here in the Virgo archetype. So, just because it's Virgo doesn't mean there's no Pisces. If Virgo is there, Pisces is there. It's just that we don't necessarily see it, but it's as big as day. So it's about forgiving ourselves. When we find, things that we've done that we're not happy about, that we're not proud of, but you know what? That's what we're here for. We're here to make some mistakes. We're not expected to be perfect. This is a perfectly imperfect world. And we have to acknowledge that and allow ourselves, some spiritual, emotional, intellectual leeway, and just be forgiving and be compassionate for who we are. But then we also have to take responsibility for who we're becoming. And we have to recognize that we cannot continue to hunker down in our south node and keep pulling the past into the future and making the past become pulling the past into the present and keep repeating the past into the future. It's about discerning the truth sometimes, or perhaps about some long-held personal belief. Are we holding on to some idea or belief that we have that's really not true? That maybe it was true at some point, but maybe it's no longer true, or maybe it was never true. It was just something that was perhaps self-validating, or something, again, that helped us, stay where we were and feel better about ourselves, but it just perhaps just kept us stuck. And it's about making choices that actualize our values as priorities. Again, really looking at, what is important to us. Where is the meaning in our lives right now? What is fulfilling for me right now? And to make that the priority. Venus and Mars oppose Chiron and Neptune and Pisces, and both of them are retrograde. So, again, this is multivalent. We could probably spend a whole hour just talking about this one aspect itself. But clearly, old relationship wounds could resurface, but hopefully not as rewounding, but rather in a forgiving and passionate framework of forgiveness, letting go of doubt and blame so that healing can begin. And I think that this is probably a core event in all relationships, because all relationships are, there's no Romeo and Juliet. It just doesn't happen that way in most cases. Yes, it happens in the movies, but in real life, it's a little bit more, closer to the ground. And so, we have all had things in our relationship that, maybe we could have done differently, we could have done better. But, again, we're working towards, some unconditional love. If this person who we live with, sleep with, eat with, play with, we love them, we have to love them all the way. We have to let go of the little stuff, because it's just little stuff. It's not meaningful. It's not meaningful, and it really holds us back, and it really comes around to bite us, if you would, because if we let it all build up, that's how some of the bigger stuff occurs, and all of a sudden, we're in trouble. So it's about that forgiveness, and it's about finding that unconditional love, that Pisces acceptance and compassion, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else. A good practice, walking around in the world, driving on the road especially, I have taken up this practice where, when I see these drivers who are just so off the wall, this Uranus, Aries, Eris thing going on, it drives me crazy, because I'm a Virgo rising, and, my moon in Aries, so, I'm like right there front and center with it. And so what I've started to do is, instead of getting angry at them, I look at them and I mentally send this message to them that I love you. It's okay. Just please move on down the road ahead of me, though. So, we can do these kinds of things and make these shifts in within ourselves. And when we do that, we can change everything around us and just have a whole different perspective on it. We have a disseminating trine from Pluto. And okay, so here's one of the helpers. Here's one of the gifts that come in when we take that hero's journey here, because this is going to empower us to find new footing in our relationships. We can feel more self-empowered. We don't have to feel again that we're not good enough, that we're not ready. We can just do it. And Pluto has only recently stationed direct. It's moving quite slowly at the moment. And so it's quite intense. Excuse me. When the planets slow down, especially when they're retrograde and they station, it's the equivalent of taking a magnifying glass and holding it up to the sun and focusing that light in a single point on something. As a kid, everybody probably did that with leaves and things and started leaves on fire. Well, the planets are doing the same thing. When they're moving slowly, or especially when they station, they're drilling down. That energy is just drilling into that single point. And they're very, very intense. It's very hot. And we're still kind of in that situation, in that environment. And we know that it's been plowing deeply through the soils of relationship. It's been plowing deeply through all the soils of our lives. It's uprooting just about everything that we take for granted. And it's eliminating what needs to go. It's seeding the future with a recharge of soul intention, different choices, different priorities. And we can come away with a newly empowered self-acceptance and forgiveness for self and others as a result, if we self-empower ourselves to just work with this. And something that I think is important, I think I just brought this up, say it again, squares and oppositions generate tensions and crises, often with others, that expose issues that need resolution. We need others. When there's an opposition, we generally project that the one part of the opposition, one or the other part, onto somebody else. And it is in that relationship dynamic that we can begin to resolve that opposition for ourselves. And the trines, on the other hand, bring in helpers and gifts that can facilitate growth in crisis. But we have to be interactive with them. We have to facilitate them and jumpstart them by being proactive and being the hero, taking that journey, not being afraid to go out and slay that dragon, whatever it looks like and however big and scary it seems to be. I love this quote. I think that this really sums up a lot of this, what I've said here, that love is not to be found in someone else, but in ourselves. We simply awaken to it. But in order to do that, we need the other person. The universe only makes sense when we have someone to share our feelings with. That's Paulo Coelho. So that's what I've got. I'll open the floor to anybody who has comments, questions, or anything that they'd like to say.
Great, Daniel. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you. Could you please click on Stop Share at the top? Great. And any questions, please go ahead. Give us a moment to think one up, Daniel.
It's okay. Maybe I answered all the questions.
Hi, Daniel.
Go ahead.
Hi. Regarding the trines and the squares, so with the squares being something that sort of needs to evolve, to put it simply, do you think the trines are like the helpers that come in to resolve those squares, simply put?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite, I don't think I understand the question.
So with squares in a chart being some sort of, difficulty or bringing awareness to something that needs to change, there's friction there, something needs to be resolved.
Yes.
And then with the trines, I really love it how you explain the trines being like a helper or some sort of gift that comes to us that we can use.
Yes.
Do you think, simply put, that can be in direct correlation to the squares in the chart? So those gifts and helpers, like to look at a chart and see it simply to help someone quite quickly, would be the squares are the areas that need to be resolved, and the trines are areas that people can use, focus on these gifts, to
Yeah.
overcome the squares?
Yes. Let's start with the trines. Trines are fruition. They're something that we have brought with us. We come in. I use the analogy that we come into the world with two suitcases. One is really, really heavy. It's dragging on the floor. Those are our lessons. The other suitcase is so incredibly light we don't even know we're carrying it. Those are our gifts. And so the trines do reflect what we have accomplished, what is a fruition experience for us, and what we've brought with us, so to speak, on our toolkit that we can use. And because that facility is there, and because the outer world responds to our inner world, those gifts show up to us physically, in one way or another, or intellectually, or in some way that gift shows up in the world when we need it. It's almost like a video game where the hero, gets a new weapon or gets, extra coins, or, I haven't played video games in a number of years, so I'm sure it's evolved way past that. But, where things show up for us because we have earned them. We've earned them by our choices, and we've earned them by the work that we have done, in most cases, previously to this lifetime. The squares in somebody's chart, each one of those squares can definitely be correlated to somebody else in the chart, and maybe different people at different times. Because we need that other person. We cannot resolve that square by ourselves. We can't resolve the opposition by ourselves. It's too big. That's why it's an opposition or a square. And we do pull in others at different times to facilitate it. And sometimes it is facilitated by a crisis, that something happens. Have you ever met somebody and you immediately, like, something, you didn't get along with them, there was like this contest, this conflict, and then something happened. Over time, they became your best friend. Something comes up, something came out in that initial confrontation, that initial meeting, which brought to a head, or brought to the surface, illuminated whatever that square or opposition is about. And over time, it resolved because it got worked with. Does that make sense?
It sure does. I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a good question. Good question.
Next question. Okay, I've got a question.
Sure.
Okay, so Venus Mars will be opposite Neptune. Well, this is in the conjunction chart, and so it's a full phase opposition. So would we say that the new cycle of Venus Mars will be shedding light on our dreams, fantasies around relationships, and perhaps resulting in disillusionment, and seeing, because it's an opposition, and seeing these dynamics very, very clearly? What do you think, Daniel?
I think it can work both ways, Linda. And again, I think it depends on the consciousness that's brought to it. There's definitely going to be some tensions in terms of, the dreaming, the ideal relationship. But do we believe that we're good enough? Do we believe that we deserve it? It cuts both ways. If we have enough self-confidence, self-worth, and belief that we deserve a holistic relationship, then it will show up. It doesn't mean that we're still not going to have to do the work, but we're going to have to come to terms with ourselves, with everything that's happened in the past, and let go of it. If every relationship we had, somehow failed or went south, we can't project that again into the future and say, well, this one's going to fail too. We have to come at it with a more compassionate and objective starting point, and just start out and say, okay, this is a whole new day, and anything can happen. That I'm not tied to the past, so we can manifest the relationship that we're hoping to have. The ideal relationship is not someone who completes us. The ideal relationship is someone who with whom we can be in a space where we can both complete ourselves. We don't have to be complete and perfect to find a perfect relationship. We just have to be open to the fact that we are growing, that we are evolving, and attract someone who feels the same way and who is open and self-examining and working on themselves, and allow the space to be created between the two. What they say, when any two are gathered in his name, so to speak, to create that creative space where the relationship can grow and flourish. So it can work either way. It depends on what we bring to it.
Thank you, Daniel. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi. Okay, I have a question, because I like kind of two questions in one question. Often, so true, we do kind of attract what we're looking for, but then the other person's got their own shadow playing in the same dynamic. And a lot of times you're imagining you do deserve this and you can't wait to have it, and then it's like you find out it's not that at all. So how can you speak on that? Because so many times they do say, like, everything in life, it's mirroring back to us, but the other person's got their own mirror going on. So, like, a lot of times things aren't really what you think they are because of Neptune. So I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
I think that the answer is in the first part of what you said, that we attract we attract what we need. Again, it comes down to fate and necessity. We attract who and what we need, and the person that we attract, if their shadow correlates to our shadow, then things are probably not going to work real well. We have to. We have to attract somebody from our light, not from our shadow. We have to forgive our shadow and come to terms with it, synthesize it, understand it, and work to heal it ourselves, or at least embrace it to the point where it's no longer a destructive influence in our lives, and we recognize it. And when it pops up, it's just like I said, I'm driving down the road, and instead of mentally, like lashing at it, the 16-year-old kid who just cut me off on the highway, to just look at him and say, I love you. It just takes a little bit of mental calisthenics, just spiritual, maybe spiritual, whatever it is, just to make a different choice. And our shadow doesn't just go away because we see it. But when we shine the light on it, it's like, if you dig up the roots of a tree and they're exposed to daylight, that tree will die. So when we expose our shadow to the light, over time, its roots will wither, and it will go away because it no longer is finding an outlet for its expression. We have to change the way we express it. So it's not that their shadow is getting in the way. It's our shadow all the time.
But you don't think the two shadows are having a relationship?
Yeah, it's a destructive one.
But also the light can too. But it just seems to me, it starts out, you see everybody's great, you just imagine and you see all the great stuff. And then after all that great stuff, where you put your ideals in someone else and vice versa, then you find out, oh, who are you really?
All relationships start out like that, Lauren. They're all great in the beginning, because everybody puts on a good face. Everybody, we have a mask. Right. Our ascendant is a mask. And so everybody's got that happy, mask on in the beginning, and like I said, the sex is great, you're having fun, you're everything's working, but over time it deteriorates. Over time it begins to go south because the real persona behind that mask begins to come out. But that negative persona was attracted by our shadow that we have not contained, or we have not, contained's not the right word, that we have not synthesized, that we have not forgiven and begun to change its expression. When we change the expression of our shadow, we will not attract that person anymore.
So I think I got it. So what you're saying, let me mirror this back, is when we have a part of ourselves that is still very wounded, and we're not really, we know it's there, but we just don't pay attention to it. it's not you know, not really giving it validation, then we attract it and somebody else will trigger that.
Right.
And then, so a good relationship is the people who are able to stay in through the whole long shot. And a lot of people aren't capable.
A good relationship is when we forgive ourselves and we attract someone who's also forgiven themselves, and the two of you can be in a space where you can work on yourself with, relationships are leapfrog. They don't grow at the same rate. One person grows and kind of leaps over the other, and then the other person grows and leaps over the first, and we go back and forth like that. We don't grow intellectually, spiritually, and physically at the same rate as our partner, and that's part of the difficulty. We're growing together, but not at the same time and the same rate. So, there's a lot of compensations that we have to make, but the first one is with ourselves, to recognize, to forgive ourselves, and to recognize that, yes, if there's a wounding that's there, to embrace it to the degree that you recognize that it's part of who you are, and to reintegrate it back into who you are, rather than have it encapsulated and have it keep working subconsciously.
Great answer, Daniel. Thank you so much. And thanks for that question, Lauren. And so that brings us to the end of your meeting, Daniel. Thank you so much. And thanks from all of us. See you next time.
And are you here long? Or, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Can you walk
Thank
outside?
you.
Yeah.